So, on November 21st, 1998, Ocarina of Time changed the world. It took 4 years to develop, and it showed because it made a massive impact. It's still the highest rated game of all time. But then, less than 2 years later, we got a direct sequel to Ocarina of Time in the form of Majora's Mask. And when I say less than 2 years, I actually mean that because although it was closer to 2 years in the United States, in Japan, it was just about a year and a half on April 27th, 2000. And when you look at the date, it's April 27th today. So I thought we should get together and talk about our experiences and reflections on Majora's Mask 20 years later. So a few things. One, how has it been 20 years already? I don't understand this. And two, how is it they made such a masterpiece in a year and a half? These are questions that both boggle my mind. So before we fully address these, let's just go around the table and get our overall thoughts on where we were at the time and what we think of Majora's Mask, or what we thought of Majora's Mask back then and perhaps now. So let's go ahead and start off with, let's start with you, Steve.
As Game Explains resident ancient, I was around, obviously, and an adult, which makes me even more sad when Majora's Mask came out. So I remember being really hyped for this. I did not pre-order it because I was at that age in adulthood where you're always broke. So I definitely did not have the money to like plan this purchase. But I happened to like run down to my local Target, and they had the box with like, the special edition Majora's Mask with the gold cart with like the lenticular label on it.
Yeah, 3D.
Yeah, and if you rotate it, you can kind of see the image on the label change. It's super cool. I have it with me still today.
It's actually the best version of Majora's Mask 3D.
Oh man. Right off the bat with those hot takes.
This game blew me away when it came out. Like this kind of I wasn't aware of the trend of like what I like to call these days mainline Zelda and weird Zelda. And so Majora's Mask was the first game that for me like kind of made it click for me that there was definitely like a branch of Zeldas that were just the weird ones.
They're the direct sequels. Zelda 2 was weird, Link's Awakening was a sequel to Link to the Past, it was weird, and Majora's Mask was a follow-up to Ocarina of Time. It's the sequels that are weird.
True. So I mean, that kind of has me super hyped for Breath of the Wild too.
Right.
Because like you said, Andre, that means that we're kind of hoping that is also going to follow the pattern of being weird. And we already saw Hyrule Castle kind of take off into the sky, so I'm hopeful. But Majora's Mask was the game that really showed me how weird Zelda could get. And I don't think any game really encapsulates what a weird Zelda is better than Majora's Mask. Like, there's nothing about this game that makes sense. And I mean that in the best possible way. Like, Link becoming, you become a Deku scrub right at the beginning of the game.
Yeah, you start the game as one practically.
Right, and I'm like, what is this?
Why does the moon have a giant face on it? They never explain it.
Why is the moon so mad? Why are there 4 Doshin the Giants over here? So yeah, I just everything about this game was weird and wacky and amazing, and I really have a hard time placing this in terms of my Zelda rankings, but I can tell you it's top 3 for sure. Like, I love this game. I love it to this day, and I've probably played through it more than any other Zelda game.
Well, top 3 is a fitting place for a game based around a 3-day time limit, so...
Ooh.
How about you, Ash? Where were you at the time, and what were your thoughts on it?
Well, I was about 16 when Majora's Mask came out, and believe it or not, I was so hyped for this game that I think it was the first game I ever imported, the first Japanese game I ever bought at a convention. And of course, I was too young at the time to know I was getting stiffed at a convention because I probably paid way more than I should have for it. But
there's no price too much for Majora's Mask.
Fair enough, that's true. But yeah, no, I actually still have my Japanese Majora's Mask cartridge. I was that hyped for this game, and I still remember when I got the the Western version and I played it, and it just I think it didn't suck me in quite as quickly as Ocarina of Time did. I think because it just took me a little time for me to kind of, I don't know, wrap my head around not only this new world that Link was pulled into, but also how oppressive it was with the time limit. And I think the opening is a little obtuse, maybe, if you're not expecting it, but man, once it gets its hooks in you, it is something special. And I think for me, I had already kind of been ingratiated into weird Zelda by Link's Awakening. So for me, this felt like a return to that style of kind of Twin Peaks-esque, kind of off-kilter, oh, this isn't the Zelda you think you know. This is something completely different. And it felt like coming back to a Link's Awakening style experience, and that, except in a 3D context, of course. And There's nothing quite like it at the time, and there's still nothing quite like it now. And Majora's Mask for me, it doesn't quite fall in my top Zeldas. I still like it, and I still appreciate it, but I don't find it as convenient, I guess, to go back to as some of the other Zeldas. And that is by design. Completely by design. You know, Majora's Mask is meant to feel oppressive, and it's meant to make you feel like you're constantly pushing up against that time limit. So it's a game for me that I think is a little tough to go back to compared to some other Zeldas like Ocarina of Time. It's like putting on an old glove, right? But that is by design, and I think that the fact that Majora's Mask being a little oppressive and being a little... There's a bit of a hurdle to get into, or to get over to get into it. But I think that the fact that that's still the case today is a good thing about it, and it makes it stand out all the more as a one-of-a-kind Zelda game. There's really nothing else quite like it.
Could that hurdle be the fact you're playing a Japanese copy of the game?
Well, that was the initial hurdle, yeah. But even when I played the Western version, though, for the first time, I remember thinking I didn't really get into it for the first few hours. I kind of... Once I got to Snowhead is when the game really got its hooks in me, and I could not put it down. But like that first opening, going through like the first temple, it didn't quite open up to me as early as Ocarina of Time did. But I also think that might be to a degree by design.
It's a bit of a slower burn, at least initially.
Yeah.
Because it is so different to what we've seen from Zelda, both thematically and in the gameplay sense. How about you though, John? Where were you at, and did you play it even upon release?
So to make all of you and a big chunk of our audience feel old, I think I was either 5 or 6 when this game came out. So my first experience was in the GameCube Collector's Edition. Apart from, I got that.
The worst one.
Exactly, I was actually kind of saved from it with a bad twist of fate, so I got that, and I played it for one day. And then I went to school, and when I came home, my entire childhood home had been burgled. So I lost everything, all my games.
Man.
So I was robbed of my Majora's Mask experience back then, and it wasn't until the Wii Virtual Console that I properly got to play it. And there's a lot of anticipation building up to this, because I was really hyped to try this game. I remember some magazines, when Twilight Princess was coming up, they were referencing Majora's Mask as the previous dark one, that Twilight Princess was allegedly going to top in its darkness, which it didn't.
Yeah, not even
But
close.
I eventually got to Majora's Mask, and what I loved about it was how it paralleled Ocarina of Time perfectly. Like, there are NPCs in that game which are directly from Ocarina of Time, and that's obviously for resource purposes, but the actual way that they pull it off makes it feel like this parallel world. Like, you see these characters who aren't the same character, but they look remarkably similar, and I don't think any other game could pull that off without it feeling cheap, but Majora's Mask has this sort of poetic energy about it, and to me, this was just a beautiful reflection of what Ocarina of Time was, and also what it wasn't. It was just this beautifully dark game.
Yeah, absolutely. And you kind of touched on something there with the characters, because not only were the characters familiar, but also different at the same time, but they felt more like actual characters. Like, they had a schedule and wants in this game. You have a whole book to keep track of these people that are now involved in your life. And that's something that Majora's Mask really built upon, that the previous Zelda games have started exploring. Ashton mentioned, I think, Link's Awakening earlier, which kind of delved a little bit into like the NPC side of things, making them more like characters. But Majora's Mask took the idea and ran with it, and it just ended up making the entire experience both very different and also more impactful, because now there was more at stake than just the abstract notion of the world ending, which is so often the case in games like this. But now you're understanding that on a character basis, where you see these characters, you see them get afraid as their imminent end is near. As the moon gets closer and closer to the planet on day 3, and the townsfolk are just freaking out and making amends or coming to grips with the fact that this is the end of them. It's wild. It's dark. This is a dark game in ways, as you guys said, Twilight Princess didn't even touch. So you guys pretty much summed up my experience. I honestly don't have that many memories specifically of playing it for the first time. I just remember being wowed by this world, like a world that felt alive in a variety of ways, with the time mechanic, which really made it feel like time mattered in a game for once, which isn't normally the case, and also again through the characters, with them not just having their own wants and desires, but you being able to influence them and make an impact on them and save them. So yeah, Majora's Mask is such a great game, and it made such great use of these entirely new systems of Zelda, in being the 3-day time limit, being the characters each having a schedule, and the fact that you have masks that not only change your gameplay, the way you play the game yourself, but also influence how characters interact with you. There's so much going on here that it blows my mind they created this amazing experience in just a year and a half. And as you said, John, it's partially because they reused elements from Ocarina of Time, the base engine, of course, and a lot of the assets, but they mixed it up in a way, remixed it in a way, that it feels completely different. I feel like truly the most bizarre Zelda there is, and I mean that in the best possible way.
It's bizarre in a good way. Like, everything's slightly left of center in a way that always makes you feel unsettled as you're going through the game, but that's exactly what it's supposed to do, and it's great. And one of the most brilliant things I think about Majora's Mask, especially relative to the time of its release, is that it subverts the whole idea of a video game. Like, those of us who grew up playing games, the whole point is, oh, you play as the hero, you save the day. But for 99% of Majora's Mask, you're not saving the day. All
losing,
these people
yeah.
you save, no matter what you do, like, okay, like the brilliant Romani Ranch side quest. You go do that, and you get the happy ending, great. But then you have to undo it all anyway. And then you realize, well, everything you did, they're not ever gonna know. Because you have to reset time over and over again. And of course, by the end of the game, yes, Termina is saved, but the whole road to that saving the day is paved by failure, and it's a game that makes you feel like you're undoing a lot of the good that you do throughout the game, which is that runs directly counter to what you expect from a video game, where you're like, okay, I'm checking this off, I achieved this goal. No, I mean, other than key items and the dungeons and such, everything you do in that 3-day period is undone every time you have to go back to the beginning of it, and it's a really uncomfortable, irritating feeling, but in a good way, because it's by design, and I thought that was really smart.
It was the game version of the Edge of Tomorrow,
Yeah.
15 years before Edge of Tomorrow.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that's so cool. Like, that time limit is, for me at least, I mean, well, I think for anyone who likes the game. First off, it's a brilliant way of, like, kind of reusing, like, kind of like getting the most mileage out of, like, a limited development cycle, in that it forces you to kind of like relive these experiences, but in a way that doesn't feel like padding. Like, it feels it's so inherent to the nature of this game that it completely works. And what else the time limit adds to the game too is, beyond being able to schedule characters around this 3-day cycle, is that it lends in a always present pressure. Like, you feel like constantly motivated to push forward. Like, there's no fishing pond in the N64 version of the game for a good reason, because you're fishing, you're doing it wrong.
Yeah.
You're not saving the world. You should be out there, like, trying to figure out how in the heck am I going to stop this moon from colliding with a planet in this 3-day cycle. So every choice you make matters, because it has weight, because it's weighted against the time you have. You spend time lollygagging around, that's going to cost you in the end. And of course, you can restart the cycle and use the knowledge you learned to improve and further through the game. Now, the game does, of course, include, like, these, smartly includes, like, basically this hard checkpoints, if you will. Like, when you accomplish certain, if you get an item, you'll keep the item as you travel through time. It's a really elegant way of kind of like making it so you can proceed through the game while also having it narratively make sense. Because everything in the world does reset, but you do keep everything you yourself had, allowing you to proceed further than you could have the first time. Super smart game design. I can only imagine the design docs must have been a nightmare, like, trying to figure all this out, like, trying to link up these schedules and items, like, everything that's possible at any given moment. The fact that they pulled this off again in a year and a half shocks me.
Yeah, I remember playing through the game on my initial run through, and that time limit just stressing me out.
Yeah.
Like, I would solve puzzles and then realize, like, I've got mere minutes left.
Right.
So I would have to, like, remember how I did those, then reset time, go back and try to find a way to do that dungeon more efficiently, so I wouldn't waste as much time getting there and getting through challenges and obstacles. But ultimately, that ended up being one of my favorite things about the game, was that there was never, I mean, when you think about Majora's Mask, there isn't a ton of content to it, which makes sense, but it feels like there's an overwhelming amount of things to do because of just how quickly you need to do them.
Right. No, that's a good point.
Yeah, I think, Majora's Mask is probably, and it's funny because Ocarina of Time, has time in the title. Time travel is a central theme to that game, but I think Majora's Mask does time travel better than just about any other game I've ever played.
Yeah.
Just because it feels, in a sense, realistic. Like, you go back, nobody remembers anything you did. You've got what you had with you. If you don't, like, deposit, the bank is a convenient thing, but if you don't deposit your rupees in the N64 version, they're gone. Like, you just lose them.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many times I time traveled and lost all my money.
Yeah.
So I just really like this. And, Andre, you were touching on this earlier, but the NPC characterization is so good because you have such a small chunk of time, right? You master the routines of everyone in Termina because there are various points where you have to interact with them at a certain time on a certain day to do things. And that feels like I got Back to the Future vibes from that in a way.
Yeah,
just because I'm like, okay, I have to know where this person is at this time on this day so that I can get this item from them to proceed forward in this side quest line that, because if you've never played the game, the Fierce Deity Mask is like the ultimate reward, and you basically have to interact with loads of people to end up getting it.
Over 20 or around 20 at least?
I think it's around 20.
Yeah, it's just... Yeah, it's an insane number, and it spans all 3 days up to the very end, and so it's just like this crazy side quest chain, and it really helps like underline just how much you get to know these people. Like if you've done that quest, you've clearly mastered the routines of the people in town, so that you could accomplish that. And I don't think any other game before or since has really done time travel to this degree or gave you that sense that you're actually moving through time.
Well, time travel in games is usually very linear, like it's just tied to the story, whereas in Majora's Mask it's entirely gameplay orientated, and nothing's really controlled by the story in that sense. And I can't think of, I guess like Prince of Persia Sands of Time, but apart from that I can't think of many other games that let you control time like that. And yeah, even since Majora's Mask, I can't really think of any.
Yeah, no, I can't either. And I guess Chrono Trigger?
I was saying Chrono Trigger. I think
I suppose Chrono
it's
Trigger.
kind of like a half measure, right? Because it's like it is tied to the story, but you can also control it to a degree. And there are side quests that have nothing to do with the main story that depend on you playing around with time. But it's not in quite the same way that Majora's Mask does it.
No, I don't. Yeah, I can't recall a game that's had time travel used this centrally to the core. At least among the AAA space. I'm sure there's probably some indie game that has.
Right.
But yeah, it kind of gets back to what you were saying earlier, John, how Majora's Mask is, I forget exactly how you put it, but like, it was in some ways a reflection of Ocarina and builds upon those concepts, because the time idea of Ocarina was a pretty big deal in two different ways. One, it had the full day cycle where you could watch the sun, the sun rise and set, and it would affect some things like the town being open or shut, but for the most part it was mostly cosmetic. It didn't really have much to do with the game itself. And then there was actually the time travel portion you mentioned where you go forward and back in time. But yeah, as cool it was at the time, it was more of just a toggle, like an on and off switch. It really felt more just like a way of just reusing the Dark World mechanic from A Link to the Past. It didn't really play with time that intrinsically to the concept of time itself. And I think it even kind of contradicts itself a few times. I could be wrong, but I feel like there's times where it treats it as like a closed loop, where you do things in the game that you hadn't done yet as a character, but characters reacted to it as if you had.
Like you teach yourself the Song of Storms in Ocarina of Time by playing it as a kid to the Music Man.
Right. Which is still so weird.
It doesn't make any sense.
No, not at all.
And I think the only time where you actually have to become a kid again is to get to the Desert Temple. So it very rarely plays with the back and forth mechanic of going forwards and back in time. It's really just like Adult Link from there on in, really.
Yeah, and that was one of my favorite parts of Ocarina of Time, is that Spirit Temple, part where it actually does play with the concept of time, and you have to visit the dungeon both as a kid as an adult. And Majora's Mask takes that concept and just makes a whole game out of it. Not that exact scenario, of course, but just playing with the concept of time. And it's not even just resetting the same time loop over and over again. You also often need to mess with the flow of time in real time with the inverted Song of Time or the Song of Double Time, depending on what you're trying to do with the Bomber's Notebook. So you're not only playing with it from a time loop standpoint, but from a moment-to-moment standpoint. And it's really, I can't... The only other Zelda example I can think of that kind of messes with time in real time like that is Skyward Sword, actually out of nowhere, because the time shift stones, which I thought was one of the smartest parts of that game.
Ingenious.
Yeah, but other than that, like Majora's or Zelda has never really played with the concept of time in such a visceral way, and I think that's definitely one of the things that is so revered, deservedly, about Majora's Mask.
Yeah, and it's interesting how central to the game, like that, even the game itself acknowledges like how central time is to the game. There's a clock always present on screen, counting down how much time you have left. There are clocks literally everywhere. Every town, or every house in the town has a clock. There's a giant clock tower. You're in Clock Town. You can see the moon growing ever closer by the day, even by the hour. And even the soundtrack reacts, so they're getting more intense, in town at least, when you're nearing the end. And yeah, you're constantly reminded that time is a commodity in this game, that it matters, and that's partially what lends it such a unique flavor. That you're always reminded of it, and that it is it's central to beating this game. And as part of that too, it again gets back to the characters, which of Clocktown is kind of a character in and of itself, or at least with how its inhabitants all react to it. And I actually just revisited the game right before this discussion, and I was immediately blown away from the moment you step into Clocktown from the clock tower, and I was just like knocked over again almost by how much is going on. I ran into that circus guy, the guy who runs the circus, and I started following him around, and he was really angry on his way somewhere, and he ended up going to a bar, and he gets shut down at the bar by the bar owner because they're not open at like noon. And so he takes a seat at the bar and just like sits there depressingly because he can't get a drink. So I went outside and I saw the mailman, started following him around for a bit. He went to the inn, and he had like a 3-second conversation with the owner, and if you don't check in with them if you don't talk to them during that time, you'll miss out on the conversation. And it's during that conversation when you hear the innkeep like inquiring about where the letter that's being delivered came from, and at the time you don't understand like why is she so concerned about where this letter came from. It's a letter, just read the darn thing. But it's only later when you play deeper into the game they understand the context of what that means and why she needed to know where that letter came from. Like, it's brilliant stuff like that really plays with the nature of the game itself, that also evolves how storytelling works in a way that we had not seen in a Zelda game up to that point.
Yeah, and like, do you know what's ingenious about the start of the game too? Is at the very beginning, the premise is to become a kid again, because you start off as Deku Link, and you've basically got to like try and escape that form, and that happens rather quickly, and so you're left with a bunch of extra time, and you could just go to the inn and sleep, and then it'll become the end of the day again. But what I love about that part there is you're just given a bunch of free time.
Right.
Like, this is part of the game. And I think it's trying to incentivize you just to go out and explore Clocktown, because that's all you can do at that point. And that's just so ingenious. I just found it so clever that it's sort of like pushing you in this direction. Because Majora's Mask is a very, like, the actual core path of Majora's Mask is very clever, but I don't think the dungeons are its strength. Like, the dungeons are good, but they're not the best of the series. And I think it's just so clever that they're trying to push you into these optional quests, because the optional quests are the best parts, in my opinion.
Yeah, the 4 dungeon thing was, I remember when, I think that news came out before the game came out. Maybe I'm misremembering, but I remember people either being concerned earlier or, it's a complaint that's come since. But the entire game is a puzzle. You have to unravel how this time works. So in a way, the entire game is like a giant dungeon. It's like, how am I going to progress through this using this 4th dimensional mechanic?
It's funny when you put it like that. It makes me think of Majora's Mask as kind of a proto Breath of the Wild, in the way that Breath of the Wild 2, its entire world is basically a massive dungeon, and the 4 quote unquote actual dungeons are almost a footnote in that game.
Right,
Kind of like Majora's Mask, which I agree with you, John. I don't think the dungeons in Majora's Mask are its strength. I do love things like Stone Tower Temple, but that's really the only one I would want to go back and like revisit, I think, especially Great Bay Temple. Not my favorite, but at all. But yeah, it is, and when you think of it like that, it is almost like a proto Breath of the Wild in terms of the way it's designed and the way the world is basically a giant puzzle.
I was kind of thinking that too, Ash, earlier, but for different reasons, where this kind of does feel like a proto Breath of the Wild in maybe how it's trying to present a world that like feels alive. Because Breath of the Wild also feels alive. Like, characters, they don't have like a 3-day cycle they go through, but you can't follow them around town. They do different things. They'll react to you in a variety of different ways. So Majora's Mask does feel like it tried to expand what a game could be in a way different, but they were kind of going for a similar thing as Breath of the Wild was. Breath of the Wild is physics-driven, more, open-ended, of course, but it seems like they were kind of like aiming at similar targets, like similar, more like loftier goals.
Right, which is what's so funny.
And they both have that freedom of movement as well. Like, putting on the Goron mask and just stalling around Termina Field, that feels so good.
It's so fun.
Yeah.
They made getting around this game fun, whether even Deku Link is enjoyable just to kind of spin around or hop across water, but it comes alive with the Goron mask and then the I was gonna say Zoro mask. Zora, thank you. Yeah, the Zora mask. I was close. Where just swimming is just inherently fun.
in the
right.
N64 version.
And that part of the pacing, in my opinion, is great. Like, even though I do think the opening of Majora's Mask can be a little too obtuse for its own good, if you're just trying to get into the game, I do love how, Deku Scrub Link, he's fun for a while, and he remains fun when you don't have to stay as him the whole time, but at the beginning of the game, he feels kind of limiting, and it's genius because you only got to play as regular human young Link for like 20 minutes before that, or 15 minutes, and you want to go back to that, because Deku Scrub Link does feel limiting to a degree, so it actually almost feels like a reward when you do get to turn back to human form. And on that note, I do love that one of the subtle ways this game kind of marks itself as a direct sequel to Ocarina of Time is when you first, in the very opening, when you're playing as young Link, he flips now. When you do a jump, he somersaults and flips, and he looks super cool when he does it. It doesn't affect gameplay, but it's a nice little nod to those who stuck with this version of Link through Ocarina of Time, and they're like, oh yeah, he's grown. He's badass now. He's a hero. He knows what he's doing. He can somersault and do all these cool things. So I thought that was a really nice little touch that doesn't necessarily affect gameplay, but it's an extra cool, like a bit of cool factor for those who were, journeyed with this version of Link through the previous game.
We were talking about the masks just a minute ago, and while I agree with everything everyone said, how much I like them, I want to comment real quick about how creepy it was putting those on for the first time.
Yeah.
Like,
painful.
That looks like it hurts.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and Link just like I mean, again, it lends kind of to that dark feeling, but like the eye sockets on those masks are dark and they're cracked around the outside, and Link just lets out like this howl. Like, I would love to see this game remade in HD, because I'm sure they could make that even more disturbing.
Well, the masks are literally dead people.
Right.
Because they're dead spirits.
Yeah, that's the other part. Like, everyone that is a mask, it's the soul of someone who has died, which is another creepy thing. And there are some particularly poignant moments with Zora Link, because the person who he died left a loved one behind, and she recognizes Link as that person.
Yeah.
And it's just gut-wrenching when you encounter her. And being like an 18, 19-year-old kid playing that, I was like, yikes. This is a little heavy. I can't imagine people that played it when they were much younger than that, kids playing this game. There's a lot to process there.
Yeah.
It's heavy that happens, and then you got this little like Zora guitar
right.
you can play immediately.
But I also love just the way the game handles subtext. It tells you just enough without telling you too much. Like, one of my favorite parts of this game is the Romani Ranch side quest, because not only for the fact
aliens.
And it has aliens, but if you fail it, it's screwed up, because Romani, it never quite tells you what happened to her, but she's walking around in a daze. She doesn't know what's going on, so you can connect the dots that some sort of experimentation, lobotomizing type thing went down. And then not only that, though, if you're at Romani Ranch on day 3, the whole Chateau Romani thing, she literally gets her little sister drunk so she doesn't have to be conscious for the end of the world. It's so dark for Zelda, and I love that about it. But it's not dark in it doesn't just throw it in your face. You kind of have to connect the dots, and Majora's Mask did that so well.
Yeah, I think I was too dumb as a kid to understand what was happening then. I don't think I connected the dots.
I don't think I did either originally,
It's only looking back where, you appreciate it more, like, growing up. It's like, oh, this is a very dark game. So,
Yeah.
And not just surface level, as you were saying.
Right. It's just, it tells you just enough without, and lets you connect the dots yourself, which kind of, that organic realization just makes it that much darker, and it kind of just... It's really well done in that sense, and not even just in terms of the story's dark elements or the side quests and such, but also the lore of the game. Like, it tells you just enough that, okay, yeah, this clock tower is weird, the Happy Mask Salesman's weird, clearly the Happy Mask Salesman isn't a regular human being, but we never quite find out what he is, and I think that's really smart.
It's so interesting because when I was just replaying the game right now, he's aware that he has to be out of town in 3 days. But you don't know why he knows. You don't know why that is or how he knows this. He just knows he's got split.
Right.
And I like that. Like, I like that there's a mystery. Not everything needs to be answered. And because sometimes the mystery is more interesting than what the resolution would be. See, Lost.
Right. No, and it's like you never quite find out the true nature of Termina. I mean, all that ever really, the furthest it goes is it's a parallel universe to that version of Hyrule. Okay, great, but like, why does it exist the way it does? Why is it, how did it get from the Lost Woods to this clock tower? Like, the where and why and when of it all is never quite answered, and I think it's for the best, and I love that about it.
Yeah, I think we'd lose a lot if a game revisits Termina. I think it's fine just living in this bubble, and I think we might even lose something if we come back to that world.
I absolutely think so. I don't know how you would revisit it outside of a remake, and I don't know I'd want to. And that's what makes this so special, along with Link's Awakening. You can't go back to the island. It is what it is. So
yeah. And I think we've seen the Zelda series actually kind of make this mistake before with A Link Between Worlds, a game that I really like. I really like A Link Between Worlds, but it was a huge misfire, in my opinion, to make Lorule, which is supposed to be this bespoke, specific,
sure,
anti-version of Hyrule, look exactly like the Dark World from A Link to the Past. It makes both locations less special. So right. I agree with you, Andre. I don't want to revisit Termina. I don't want no Lomina, Hymena, just Termina. Let's just leave it in this game and not revisit. Oh man, I hear it once you said it.
I was waiting.
I heard it once you said it. Yeah, just leave Termina alone. There's nothing quite like it in Zelda, and that's for the best.
I don't disagree. Termina is such a different and special place that revisiting it would only kind of detract from the magic of what it is or what it was. I like it existing as its own self-contained thing. I would love if they revisited some ideas from this game.
Sure.
Because I think Majora's Mask, as I was kind of saying earlier, I think it did feel like a proto Breath of the Wild, as you also touched on, Ash. Just in different ways than Breath of the Wild, and in ways that haven't been touched upon really since, or certainly not as in depth. I've already mentioned the time system, of course, in-depth characters. Breath of the Wild kind of did its own little thing with characters again having their own light schedules, and then even town-wise, I don't think we've seen anything that rivals Clock Town outside of possibly Windfall Island in terms of characters and things to do. But even then, that's more superficial than it is intrinsic to the whole game and the entirety of the game. And of course, even the act of transforming yourself, which we've touched on a bunch, but even how that makes a game feel different. We talked about how you begin the game with a Deku Shrub, and one of my favorite results of that is not just how everyone reacts, but how even other creatures treat you differently. A dog attacks you the moment you step out into town, and it's what's going on? Why is this dog attacking me?
And each different character has their own great traits in different parts of the world. There's the swamp, where Deku Link can hop across those lily pads, and it feels so good to do that. And that's one thing that the 3DS version really butchered, because it just feels slow and tedious and cumbersome to hop across those pads now, because each time your momentum resets. And that sense of momentum in the N64 version was part of why it felt good in the first place.
Yeah, I was shocked how good it felt to return to when I was just playing it right now and hopped into my complete file just to try all the masks again, and they were all fun to use. So I guess we have to talk about the 3DS remake a little bit, because it really was a remake in many ways. It updated the visuals like the Ocarina of Time one did, but it went farther than the Ocarina of Time. It changed quite a few things about the game, both on a fundamental level and also on a more individual level, like changing the boss fights, for instance. They all have now a giant eyeball that pops out. But then they changed other things too, like the controls, as we mentioned, with the Zora swimming and a few other characters, or the lily pad hopping as Deku Link, and then they even changed the save system as well. So what are your guys' thoughts on the 3DS remake? Did you play it all the way through, or if at all, and how did you think it stacked up to the original? But some things were better, obviously, graphics, frame rate, things of that nature.
I really liked it. In fact, I reviewed it, and I actually really enjoyed it. I definitely think that it does not replace the original, because it, as you said, Andre, it makes so many changes that are fundamental to the original Majora's Mask experience, both in a good and bad way, but I think some of those things they step on each other's toes anyway. I like the fact that the 3DS version is more convenient to play. The save system is a lot more forgiving. It makes it much easier for me to go back to. On the other hand, though, it does take away a lot of that feeling of dread and pressure, and which was an intentional part of the game design to begin with. So while I do think that it makes it a more convenient game to play from a design standpoint, that still runs against the game's intentional design ethos anyway. So it's also a bad thing. So I think I think that the 3DS version is both a step forward and a step back in a way. It's kind of weird.
It kind of makes it feel like just another Zelda in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And when you do that, the flaws become more evident. The dungeons not being as clever as Ocarina of Time, that becomes more evident when you're not pressured constantly. And also some changes were just for the worse. Like, Deku bouncing is just bad now. Zora swimming is insultingly bad. And the boss battles, I think a lot of them are just... Some of them are just, like, really boring. There's the boss fight where you're a giant, which, that's cool for a couple of minutes, but it goes on for so long. There are so many phases, and some of them are new to the 3DS version. And it's just too much at times. I don't think they needed to touch up the bosses this much. Because in a way, Majora's Mask's bosses were quite dynamic. Like, that first one doesn't really have just one method to take it down, whereas the 3DS version does, and I just found it to be really restrictive compared to the N64 version.
I think you touched on something there that's a really good point, is it felt more like a Zelda game, more like a typical Zelda game, and as an extension of that, it feels more game-like. For a few different reasons. The bosses, I think, were less open-ended now. I think in the original there was a few ways to go about them, whereas here it's more digital feeling. And that applies to the Bomber's Notebook too, which some would consider an upgrade, and it's much easier to track what's going on. But also makes just the world feel more digital, instead of like kind of organically learning how things work, you can just consult your notebook now and see, what you need to do. And that kind of takes away from the immersion for me. And then of course, on that note, as Ash was really touching on, They changed the save system, which I know some people adore because it gets over the biggest hurdle with the game, which I understand this is kind of a fairly divisive game by Zelda standards. But that save system is so core to the identity of Zelda, the identity of Majora's Mask, in that there is no safety net. There is no safety net. Like, if you screw up, you're done. Like, you have to reset time and start over and use the knowledge you learned. But even if you ignore that, because you can't ignore it, you don't have to take advantage of the fact that you can now largely save anywhere you want and always reset back to that point you saved at. But even ignoring that, you always know in the back of my mind, if I really screw something up, I can go back to that save point. It's still a good game, but I would never recommend it over the original if you want to experience Majora's Mask as it was originally intended.
It's funny, the 3DS version makes it even more apparent why Majora's Mask, the original version, is so special, because it was made by Nintendo in 1999-2000. Majora's Mask 3D feels like Majora's Mask made by modern Nintendo, in the way that modern Nintendo doesn't trust its players as much to be able to figure things out. They want to hold your hand. They want to meet you where you are as much as possible, almost to the point of coddling you. And I think Majora's Mask is a great game that stands on its own, despite some of the drawbacks, in the 3DS version. And I do like that it's more convenient to play. But definitely, the original version exists as it does because that was before Nintendo. That was before Wii era Nintendo, where they wanted to make everything as user-friendly and as convenient as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of that. I still don't know how they look at Zora swimming, though, and say, hey, let's just butcher that. Like, there's no way... I don't understand what benefit that had.
I gotta go back and re-experience Zora swimming in the original, because that was one of the... And I remember talking about this with you at the time, Andre, that Zora swimming felt fine to me in the 3DS version, so I need to go back and feel how it felt in the original, because I never saw that to be an issue.
Well, I think here's the thing, though. With Zora swimming, you basically go very slowly. It's like you're swimming normally, without any sort of special upgrade. And then you have your magic ability, which gets you into the default Majora's Mask speed of the N64 version, but it gets used up so quickly. So you get into that big Zora lake on the way to the Great Bay Temple to try out the swimming mechanic. And almost immediately, you're sort of punished for it, because the magic meter just goes down as soon as you get in there. So it's basically just like a boring swimming power-up, almost like Skyward Sword swimming, until you use the magic meter, which you can't really use.
Right.
Say no more, Skyward Sword swimming. That's
what it feels like.
I guess so, yeah. I didn't feel that bad to me in the remake, but that might be because, again, I just forgot the context of the original, so I'm sure if I did, then yeah.
Steve, did you play the 3DS remake? And what did you think of it?
I did, and I have
It was his Game of the Decade nominee for one of the years.
Oh god, that's right! How could I forget?
Right.
So here's the thing. It is the inferior version of Majora's Mask, but that doesn't make it a bad game.
That's
like
fair.
you can still make an inferior version of an excellent game and still have it be like a great game on the other end of it. Saying a game is in my top 3 Zeldas means it's definitely in my top 5 of all games of all time.
Right.
Most of my top 5 are Zelda games. So Majora's Mask, like the original, is way up there for me. And Nintendo definitely screwed it up a little bit. with the 3DS version. But there are good things about it. Like you said, Andre, it's got a better, more stable frame rate.
Yeah.
It's a prettier game overall. And I don't think anybody's going to complain that it looks better. But there are things. The save system for me is the number one thing that is not great about this. I can put up with the Zora swimming. It's not fantastic, but it does, it's serviceable. It's not like a hard to use mechanic. It just doesn't feel like Zora Link is any better at swimming than normal Link, which is counterintuitive.
Right.
Because that's Zora's
I think
whole
you
thing.
can complain that it looks better. 'Cause it almost looks too clean at times, whereas the original had this kind of darker edge to it. Like when you go into the hotel area, the wallpaper is kind of like ripping off the edges in the N64 version, whereas in the 3DS version, it looks pristine.
That's fair.
Yes, I mean, looking nicer, obviously it does, in a lot of areas. But I think the tone is sometimes lost.
Do you think part of that is due just to the generational difference in hardware, though, with the N64's crude polygons and blurry textures, that it just, that was just a function of the original hardware it came out on?
To an extent, yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
I also think that they can sort of recapture that vibe, though, while not
Sure.
looking quite as clean as they do.
Yeah.
We see that with this thing of another remake. I'm trying to think of another remake that isn't like a gritty remake, but I think other games do achieve this, though.
I think actually we could even point to Ocarina of Time 3D, which I think most people would say that's definitely the superior version of that game. But some of the visual changes they made, like the bottom of the well, they got rid of some of the bloody elements and stuff that made it really drove it home just how screwed up like Dead Hand was. Dead Hand wasn't nearly as creepy or as scary looking as he was in the original N64 version. So I know what you mean.
Yeah. Ultimately, though, I guess I would say I like Majora's Mask 3DS. It's good, but I honestly never finished it.
Yeah.
Oh.
I got to a certain point and I said, I've had my fill of this. This doesn't... The big thing for me was the save system. It took away that feeling of tension for me, and I think that to me is core to the experience.
Yeah, actually,
I no longer felt the fear of time running out.
Right.
'Cause that was fine. I didn't need an owl statue. I could just do what I wanted.
Yeah.
And that to me was a big thing because I remember a lot of times, and I mentioned this, suddenly I'm in too deep. I can't finish what I'm doing, and I just have to reset time and take my losses. That sense of tension, that sense of like, oh crap, I got to get a move on, is just completely gone in the 3DS version, and that's what tanked the experience for me. That's what led me to put it down without rolling the credits.
Yeah.
I also recognize, though, that some people didn't like the original but do love 3D, and this puts me in two different perspectives, because in my perspective, I don't really like 3D, but I do appreciate that people can play Majora's Mask through it, but it also isn't the same Majora's Mask that I love, which, I don't want to take away their enjoyment for loving it, but to me it just isn't quite the same game.
Yeah, they love a different game, a different take on Majora's Mask, which is completely fine and valid. It's so weird because so much of it is very similar, but they changed some of the core fundamentals that do have a giant impact on the whole experience. So here's a question then for all of you. What would you like to see in a proper HD remake of Majora's Mask? What do you think they could do to better and improve the experience? And would you want it to be more of a reimagining or more of a remaster? What would you kind of want to see in a Majora's Mask, remake?
I'm more in the remaster camp. I've been thinking about this since we started this because I anticipated this question coming up. And having recently played through Final Fantasy VII Remake, and I loved it. But it did take huge liberties with the story. I don't necessarily want that level of remaster, but what I want to see is some mechanical differences. So, for instance, I personally find that the old Z targeting system, while it's functional, it hasn't aged super great. I think combat in Zelda has become much better in the last 20 years. So I would love to see them almost recreate Majora's Mask in the Breath of the Wild engine with all its physics, with improved combat mechanics, that type of stuff. But beyond that, I want it to stay. I want it to stick to the script. Mm-hmm. However, I'm a big fan of options. The more options, the better, I like to say. So I would be totally cool if there was a toggle in the options, like, hey, I want it to play like the 3DS remake, or I want it to play like the N64. Mm-hmm. Quest lines and everything, and changes being what they are. But I think the key here for me is that they give you that option. If you want that tense experience that can almost lean into horror a little bit, then I want that available. But if you're somebody who grew up on the 3DS version and that's the version you love, I would be super happy if Nintendo included that as an option for players. I just don't. Me personally, I'd rather it skew closer to the N64.
Yeah, it should offer you the choice, like which experience do you want? And there's been some games that have done that before, like you want the original or the retooled version.
Right, and I do agree. I think that would be the approach to take. I think more options is always better, as you said, Steve. And I also fall kind of on the remaster side of things. I'm actually currently playing through FF7 Remake, and I'm absolutely adoring it. And I'm loving the liberties that have been taken with the story because I don't know what to expect. But at the same time, Majora's Mask is very singular in its tone, and I just don't know if I would want... Not that I don't love modern Nintendo, I just don't know if I would want modern Nintendo to take a stab at trying to recapture that specific vibe, because I think they would fall short of the mark. I think they would get cold feet in terms of making it as dark as it was already, doing that again. I think they would get cold feet and come up short and make certain thematic concessions to not make it quite so raw. And that would, to me, would be taking away one of the things that makes Majora's Mask so unique and so singular. So I would rather them remaster it as it is, instead of try to recapture it in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, I was processing this while you guys were talking, and the first thing that came to my mind was give it an M rating, but then it occurred to me that would just undermine a lot of stuff. I think a lot of the key points are so potent because they're implied, like we were saying earlier, and I think if you take those implications away, it's not as clever anymore. Like, if you have that part and when she's drinking Lon Lon milk, if she's just drinking alcohol, then I think that's going to make the scene feel kind of... It's just not quite as impactful as it would have been otherwise. So, if anything, I want them to take influence from Majora's Mask and put it into another Zelda game, rather than trying to replicate the same game again. But if they were to redo it, then a remaster is fine. But I would like them to stick a bit more to the gritty tones of the original rather than the 3DS palettes. Because sometimes the 3DS version can be a bit too colourful, a bit too vibrant, which doesn't always suit the world.
Yeah, I think for me, I do agree with that. I think I would like to see something along the lines of what they attempted to do with the 3DS remake, just on TV, on the TV, and at least an option to play the truer to the original experience. But I would love to see this game in full HD, redone character models, upgraded music, things of that nature.
Yes.
Yeah.
Music is a must.
Yes.
It's a crime that Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask got remade, and the soundtrack sounds the exact same.
I hate
and
that.
I will also go a step farther and say I want them to redo the Termina Field song. I hate it.
It's so bad.
It's so bad. It's one of the few things I don't like about the game.
Yeah. Well, that was the problem that Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask always suffered from, is that they both have fantastic soundtracks, but the samples they used to create them were among the worst the N64 ever had. And we know that the N64 is capable of way more, despite its limited sound capabilities, because of games like Banjo-Kazooie, Super Smash Bros. Like, it could have done so much more. And while I do think it was the right thing to do in terms of the original version of Majora's Mask using those same poor samples, because it kind of further drove home that parallel universe, this is what you know, but not quite what you know type of vibe. I do think that for a proper HD remaster, were they ever to do one, let's get an orchestrated soundtrack in there, or just much better samples.
Yeah.
Much better.
There's also one big quality of life improvement they could add in. Like, we were praising Stone Tower earlier, but the climb up to Stone Tower is very tedious, because you gotta keep playing that song that puts a statue version of you down. And you've got to do that multiple times for each mask, and each time you've got to equip the mask, you've got to play the song again, which you have to memorize, and if you can't memorize it, you've got to go back in the menu and then look at the notes again, and do it over and over and over. And why can't there just be like a quick button to just play the song again, or just like a clone button, or something a bit easier than that? Because it sucks doing that over and over.
I could be totally wrong, but I think that might have been one of the things the 3DS Remake actually did for the better. I think they did something to improve that section. Maybe it was skipping the song. I forget how it worked exactly, but I thought that was something that they had improved.
I think I just played the song still. There might be some other way.
I could be misremembering. Maybe I just want to give that game credit for something. No, I agree with you. That's something they could definitely fix. So here's another question for you guys. It sounds like we're all more or less pretty big fans of Majora's Mask. Is the game better than Ocarina of Time? So real quick, before we answer that, two things I want to point out. Ocarina of Time is still the highest rated game on Metacritic. It's number 1. Majora's Mask, I think, is somewhere in the 20s, or top 20, somewhere around there. It's down the ways, but still very respectable. But if you look at the sales, Ocarina sold 7.5 million copies on the Nintendo 64. Majora's Mask sold less than half of that at 3.3 million. Do you think that's a reflection of the game's quality, and what's your personal take on it? Do you think it's better than Ocarina?
I do.
That's a really hard question to answer.
Well, Steve took no
It's
time
so
at
different.
all.
No, it doesn't.
Okay.
And here's the reason why. Majora's Mask tells an infinitely more engaging story. And it weaves that story into gameplay in a way Zelda had not managed to do up to that point. Everything around you reminds you of what's going on in the world. And there's just this incredible atmosphere to this game that isn't present in Ocarina of Time. And that's not saying I don't like Ocarina of Time. Ocarina of Time is an amazing game and incredible. I think the reason why I think it did so much better and it had such a better critical reception is, one, this game is divisive. Not everybody's okay with like the stress of, having to deal with the world ending. It's a pretty dark thing to think about. And some really messed up stuff happens in the game, like we've covered already with the NPCs and stuff they start doing right before the end of the world. But you also have to remember, if you were around when Zelda 64, as it was then called, was being hyped, it benefited from 4-5 years of marketing hype. Where Nintendo would not shut up about this game for years. Nintendo of the mid to late 90s is just vastly different from the Nintendo of today, where Nintendo now likes to announce games that are at most 6 months to a year out. They basically announced that they were working on a new Zelda before the N64 was even out, and they took years to get this thing onto shelves. And there were previews upon previews and videos, whereas Majora's Mask was kind of a blip. It appeared and came out very soon after it was unveiled publicly, compared to Ocarina of Time, and yet still managed to sell, by those days' standards, a lot of copies. But for me, it's just it's a much more memorable game. I like going back to Ocarina. I love playing it. I think mechanically it's a really great game. But I don't think the world is anywhere near as well realized as it is in Majora's Mask.
I kind of go the opposite direction. I like Majora's Mask a lot, but for me, Ocarina of Time is the superior game. It's the game that I have wanted to go back to more often over the years. It's the game I have gone back to more often over the years. I think it's the more consistent game. I deeply dislike the dungeons in Majora's Mask, mostly. And there's not even one of them I ever really want to go back and play. Even Stone Tower Temple, yeah, it's really unique, but I don't really want to go back and play it. Whereas the Forest Temple, to me, in Ocarina of Time, is like one of the very best dungeons in the entire series. And I know, Steve, you were saying that the world isn't anywhere as near as well realized, and the atmosphere, and I'm not sure I agree. It's not as weird, and it's definitely not as oppressive, and I do think that Ocarina of Time could have taken things further after the time jump. And, instead of just waking up in Castle Town and things are all messed up and you see all the re-deads, that feeling should have permeated throughout all of Hyrule Field until you've saved the world and beat Ganondorf. It is too easy to get, out of that area, and then everything's like, oh, green fields, blue sky. But I think individual areas in Ocarina of Time, like when you wake up in Castle Town or going up Death Mountain, Zora's Domain, the music in that area, and just the Forest Temple, the music, the atmosphere there. I don't know. The bottom of the well, the Shadow Temple. I think Ocarina of Time is oozing with atmosphere. And while I do think Majora's Mask is certainly, no question, the more unique setting, the more unique scenario, and I think the highs are probably a little higher, I don't think it's as consistent, for me at least. And so I really like Majora's Mask, but I do consider Ocarina of Time to be the superior game between the two.
That is super well said, Ash. I don't know how to answer this question because both of them are amazing games for different reasons. Majora's Mask is a very personal game. Ocarina of Time, I think the key word Ash said was consistent. It is very consistent. From beginning to end, the pacing feels flawless. It's just taking you on this ride with barely any downtime. And I, honestly, going back to Ocarina of Time, I can replay that game any day and still love it. Majora's Mask, I think that's the most impactful the first time you play it. You can go back, obviously, but then I think you start to look at some of the flaws it has, key being the dungeons. But that's also not what the game's really about. So it depends what you're looking for in these games. If you're looking for a core Zelda game, Ocarina of Time. But if you're looking for something that's a bit more impactful and more personal, Majora's Mask. So I don't know which one's my favorite.
Yeah, it's not an easy question. You touched on something, I forget exactly what it was you said, but it reminded me of something that is something as it relates to both games, and that's going back to it, and that is Ocarina of Time, for as impactful as it was back then. I think you mentioned that you can go back to it endlessly and have fun, and while that's true for me as well, Ocarina of Time feels more dated, I think, because we've seen those same ideas reused so many times, not just by Zelda series, or the Zelda series of which there have been many games since, but also like other games as well. Arguably, a lot of it done better, I would say. Maybe not all together fully coherently, but Majora's Mask stands apart so much. It is unique, as I think everyone's been saying, that I find it competes less with more modern experiences, but it's such a unique thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think people can criticize both Breath of the Wild and Majora's Mask for the same reasons as well, because people looking for that core Zelda experience will always criticize Breath of the Wild for its lack of dungeons, and Majora's Mask is kind of the same.
What's funny is that might be one of the reasons why I like Majora's Mask and also Breath of the Wild is I've never been the biggest dungeon fan. I love the Zelda games, but I've never been huge on the dungeons. Like I never think, oh, I gotta replay that dungeon. So Majora's Mask only have 4 is a perk to me.
Fair enough.
All right. Well, guys, any final thoughts about Majora's Mask at all you want to get out there before we fully wrap it up?
No, I mean, honestly, I think we've all really touched on different aspects of why this game is so memorable and so fantastic and unique. And I do hope that Nintendo one day decides to revisit it as with a proper HD remaster. And, even if all we can get is an upscale of Majora's Mask 3D to 720p to play it more nicely on big screens, if they could do that and also give us the option to play, with N64 mechanics, I think that would be enough for me as well if they decided to go that route. But I do think that if they do decide to revisit this game again, I think they should hew more closely to the original design ethos of the N64 version and maybe not make it quite so convenient, or at least give you the option, as Steve was saying, which I agree with you, Steve. More options are always better.
Yeah, I would love to see a remake of this. I am terrified that if Nintendo does decide to go the full remaster route, that it will be a decidedly inferior version. But I'm hopeful, we've got these rumors that Mario's going to see re-releases for its anniversary. Zelda isn't far behind Mario in terms of age.
1 year, I think?
So, yeah, exactly. So I'm hoping that we get a huge, amount of Zelda remasters. I don't think we will. Those are probably much harder games to do that with than Mario games in general. Although 3D Mario games are getting bigger and bigger. So
and if you remake Ocarina, you remade half of Majora. So
that's true. That's true.
There you go.
I would love to see. I hope next year we get some cool stuff for Zelda fans that are ancient like me, and get some cool goodies. Hopefully in the form of Ocarina and Majora remasters. But I won't hold my breath. But if we do get them, I'd love to see them. And like Ash said, I'd be happy if they were just Majora's Mask 3D upscaled for more modern devices. Hopefully with some mechanical rollback options where we can play it closer to the way it was meant to be played on the
Nintendo
64.
can't even get rollback options in the Smash Brothers Online. The only other point I wanted to bring up, I don't know if it's a point so much as just an observation, and that is how much this game kind of has in common with another game that came out right around the same time, only a few months earlier, and I wonder if maybe that blunted some of the reaction to Majora's Mask, and that is, and maybe Steve can speak more to this, but he loves the series. Actually, do you know where I'm going with this, Steve?
I don't.
All right.
Shenmue.
Yeah, John knew.
Oh, right.
That's right. Where you have
course.
this very intricate world based around, not based around time in Shenmue's case, but time is a factor in Shenmue, where characters, are more than just your usual NPCs. They have schedules. You can follow them around town, for instance. You can talk to them different times of day. And it's interesting that both games are exploring it from slightly different angles at that time. So I don't know. I don't know if that means anything or that blunted reaction to Majora's Mask at all because it'd been done a little bit before.
That's a good question. for me, I didn't put together that those games released so closely because I bought the American version of Majora's Mask and the Japanese version of Shenmue. So, a little bit of a skew. I didn't play those concurrently with each other or even close to concurrently. But there is kind of an interesting thread there to pull in that they do both have this core mechanic of their NPCs kind of feeling a lot more alive than games of the time did. But I can't imagine that there was much overlap. I didn't draw that comparison ever until just now. So
Yeah, same. I didn't even think. I mean, it's so true, but I didn't think about that.
Right. I think people played Shenmue at the time of its release for a number of reasons. One, it was one of the best looking games ever made at the time. It was certainly the most expensive.
It had the highest budget of any game at the time.
It was this huge high budget open world game, as much as games could be open world back then. And it was such a new concept that they didn't even have a name for the genre, and Sega tried to coin this awful name called Free, which stood for Full Reactive Eyes Entertainment.
Oh my God.
Which is it's the most Sega thing ever. And whereas Majora's Mask had the similarity in the sense that the NPCs kind of had their daily routines, but I don't think people were really connecting the dots there. And I think that the two games in terms of tone and theme were so drastically different that one could not possibly satisfy the desire for another in that sense. Like one is much more based in real world activities, down to the weather and just killing time playing video games and stuff. Whereas the other, Zelda is more of a fantasy type of game. So at least for me as a fan who was around during the time and bought and played through both games, I just didn't see a real distinction there.
Yeah, and I think that what's different about Majora's Mask is yes, it's a little inconvenient to play, but that's by design. Whereas, I have a ton of respect for Shenmue, especially in the context of the time that it came out, but Shenmue is inconvenient to play despite the rest of the game, because if you happen to get to a storefront 5 minutes after it closes, well, guess you're wasting the rest of the day and going back to sleep and trying again. Like, there's nothing that's quite so viciously annoying in Majora's. Like, again, it's intentionally kind of inconvenient by design to play, but nothing even approaches that level of annoyance when something like that happens despite the rest of the game.
I guess Nintendo had kind of like a light version of that with Animal Forest on the N64.
Not true.
Because Animal Crossing relied around time as well, in very similar manners to Shenmue.
That's pretty interesting, just based on real time rather than a sped up in-game time.
Right.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. There's a lot of time stuff going on then.
Yeah, it's worth noting that Animal Forest and Majora's Mask are both 64DD refugees, too.
That's true.
Right.
Like Nintendo had this whole thing. Like they had a huge amount of love for real-time activities back then because they're like, oh man, we're building this add-on and it has a clock and that's the most exciting thing about it.
Right.
And we're going to make every game use this real-world clock. And then they scrapped so many of them. And I'd love to know the story behind that, like why, because they still released the 64DD, obviously. But at some point they decided, like, this is not a great move. And we're gonna port over a bunch of our games to carts and cut features. And we're just going to throw batteries in the cart so they can have their clocks still.
And to that point, too, Majora's Mask is one of the few games that requires the expansion pack, which the 64DD had inherently or had built in 4 extra megs of memory, and they needed those when they brought the cartridge instead. And it shows, though, too. Like, Majora's Mask, I think, is overall better looking and more impressive game, I think, in some respects than Ocarina of Time, such as everyone having their own schedule, as we touched on. But I do think it is interesting that Nintendo was kind of exploring what was perceived as a next-gen element with this whole, living world on the Nintendo 64 hardware, which is pretty impressive, even if it required an expansion pack.
Well, and the fact that they did it back on the N64 with the expansion pack and did it way better than modern games that I can think of.
Yeah.
Also trying to anchor themselves around a real-time mechanic. Like, I'm thinking of Lightning Returns right now, and I did not like that game at all. And that's a PS3 game, and yeah, it's anchored but with a real-time limitation. The towns have their own schedules, NPCs have their own schedules, but it's not even like a 56th as fun to play as Majora's Mask is, and the time mechanic isn't handled nearly as well as a Majora's Mask, an N64 game. So it's just crazy, and it makes me respect Majora's Mask that much more for being as good as it is and nailing that that really tricky real-time gameplay element that a lot of games since haven't been able to do.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because for as weird and unique as Majora's Mask is, at its very core foundation, it's still a very good game. A very good Zelda game that they just introduced these other weird and unusual elements for, and it worked out in this case. Which is exactly why we're here discussing it 20 years later. And with that, I think we about reached the end of our 20th anniversary retrospective discussion on The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. But what do you all think of the game? Let us know by posting in the comments below, as we'd love to hear what you think. And with that, thank you so much for watching, and make sure to click that subscribe button if you haven't already for tons more on Zelda games in the future, and more retrospective discussions, and everything else Nintendo as well. We'll catch you later. Bye.